glad you could come. I'd like to welcome you all here to the Palestine Center, both everyone here sitting in this room as well as anyone who is tuning into our live stream. The interns here at the Palestine Center, which includes Molly, Paul, and myself, are very proud to continue presenting our summer lecture series to you entitled Palestine Abroad, the Role of the International Community in the Palestine Issue. Today's lecture is the second in the series, and it's entitled Interest from All, Foreign States in the Israel-Palestine Negotiations, with Michele Dunne and Jenab Tutunji presenting. We'd also like to mention that next week on the 5th, we'll be concluding our lecture series with our final panel entitled International Organizations, a New Forum for Discussion, featuring Phyllis Bennis and Nidal Sliman. Our event today, Interest from All, Foreign States in Israel-Palestine Negotiations, seems an appropriate topic when discussing the Israel-Palestine conflict. Though it's crucial that we understand the realities on the ground, it's also necessary that we understand how outside states particularly interact with the region and influence events there. We have to examine the role of foreign states each time that Israelis and Palestinians come to the negotiating table, from the United States to countries such as Turkey, Qatar, Egypt, and others. Michele Dunne and Jenab Tutunji are here to shed some light on these interactions, both past and present, particularly the recent events going on in the Gaza Strip. Michele Dunne is a senior associate in the Middle East program of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where her research focuses on political and economic change in Arab countries, particularly Egypt, as well as U.S. policy in the Middle East. She was the founding director of the Rafiq Hariri Center for the Middle East at the Atlantic Council between 2011 and 2013, and was a senior associate and editor of the Arab Reform Bulletin at the Carnegie Endowment from 2006 to 2011. Jenab Tutunji is an academic and former journalist. He's taught at George Washington University since 1995 on Middle East subjects and comparative politics and political economy. He's also taught courses at Georgetown University and American University. He's currently a political economic analyst at the United Arab Emirates Embassy in Washington and holds a PhD in political science from George Washington University and an MA in philosophy from the American University of Beirut. And without further ado, I'd like to present Dr. Tutunji as our first speaker.
First, in the interest of modesty, I should point out I'm a professorial lecturer, not a professor in that sense. And as far as my working at the UAE Embassy, please understand that nothing that I say represents the government or the Embassy of the United Arab Emirates. Hello? Hello? I have to speak like this. Okay. Well, we're supposed to talk about mediators in the peace efforts, and I didn't want to bore you by rehashing old material. Michele Dunne will be talking about the contemporary situation in Gaza, and I thought I would talk about background, about conditions that any mediator has to cope with if he's trying to broker some kind of deal, some kind of peace between Israel and the Palestinians or Israel and the Arabs. And there is a problem in Israel as far as that is concerned. And that has to do with a number of factors, primarily the militarization of society, the outsized role of the military in decision-making in foreign policy, particularly in at crucial points, the fact that the military prefers a solution where it's in control of the situation rather than relying on a piece of paper and the good intentions of the other party. This is normal for military. The other consideration is there have been changes in Israel since the 1967 war. And when the war ended and Israelis found themselves in control of all of the area of Palestine, particularly the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, many people took this as a sign from God, that God has favored them, that God is smiling on them, and that this is something they should hold on to, not something that they should give up, relinquish in some kind of peace deal. Okay. There are other factors. I mean, obviously, what I just said led to a shift to the right, an increase in religiosity, an increase in nationalism, a decrease in the desire to make a solution that involves trading territory for peace. What you get with the right wing coming more and more into control with a series of Likud governments and their allies, you have a new approach, which is peace for peace, not peace for territory. Okay, if you give us peace, we'll give you peace. That's the deal. Okay. In addition, there is the structure of the Israeli political system, the electoral system itself, which is proportional representation, tends to lead to a large number of parties entering parliament. In a proportional representation system, you get the same percentage of seats in parliament as the proportion of the popular vote that you won. Normally, for instance, in the United States, in Great Britain, you have a winner-take, the first past the post, the winner-take-all system which magnifies majorities. So as a result, Israeli governments from the beginning have been coalition governments. There hasn't been a single party that was strong enough to form a government on its own, even in the heyday of labor. Okay. So you have a curious situation where minor coalition partners have to be taken into consideration. So the settler movement, for instance, and its representatives have an outsized say in the government. And you may or may not have noticed that during the negotiations over the past year, the negotiations that Secretary Kerry started, Netanyahu was in an embarrassing position because he had members of his own coalition threatening to pull out if he actually reached a peace deal. And in fact, the only way he could carry it through would be to drop some coalition partners and form a coalition with the Labour Party in order to have a sufficient majority to do anything. And that he was not keen on. At the same time, other parties were restless and threatening to leave if something was not achieved. So this gives you an idea of the complexity of the situation. Right? All right. I could elaborate on these, but I don't want to take the time now. If you want to ask me questions later, I'd be glad to talk about it. So if we want to look at examples of the dominance of the military in Israeli politics, for instance, in the '67 war, this is a long topic for, it can be a long topic for debate, but neither Israel nor Egypt actually wanted a war. Okay? However, the Israeli cabinet had not made plans for what to do as a result of the war. Whether they wanted territory, did they want the West Bank, did they want the Golan Heights, etc. These were not decisions made by the cabinet. What happened is that the military sort of forced Moshe Dayan on Levi Eshkol, forced him to make Dayan Minister of Defense, and then Dayan took the decisions, ad hoc. But the main purpose of the war for the military was to cut the Egyptian army down to size, to neutralize an emerging threat from Israel, and was able to do it, regardless of what the politicians thought. In the 1982 war in Lebanon, Sharon, who was Minister of Defense, made all the decisions. He didn't bother to inform the cabinet, except for Begin, whom he informed sometimes after the fact. Okay. So the military has a lot of clout. Okay. In addition to the militarization of society, in the sense that an Israeli who is born in Israel finds himself in a situation rather different than one finds in most countries. There is what has been called a religion of security. Just as a child is born into a certain religion, so too an Israeli is born into a very different geopolitical world with its attendant dilemmas. Just as a child accepts unquestioningly the religion he is born into and some basic answers he receives, so too the Israeli child absorbs at a very early age the basics of the core belief of national security. Okay. Now, these are difficult terms to work with if you're trying to push through a peace deal. Okay. There have been cases in the past where mediation was successful. The notable examples are after the 1973 war, when the United States stepped in and saw an opportunity. Kissinger saw an opportunity to push the Soviets out and to become the protector, the friend of both Egypt and Israel. And he concluded a series of agreements, Sinai 1, Sinai 2, Golan Agreement, which led to later the peace deal between Egypt and Israel eventually, passing through Camp David. Okay. All right. Why did that work? Okay. Well, to begin with, what Sadat was trying to do was not to defeat the Israeli army. He was trying to shake things up. And to do that, he amassed a considerable force that could make an impact on the Israeli army and put into question the vaunted superiority and might of the IDF. Okay? And that did shake them up. Okay? If you compare that with what Hamas is doing now, there's no chance. There's no comparison. I mean, some people have suggested that Hamas is trying to shake things up by firing rockets at Israel. Well, this is not shaking the military. It's reinforcing the sense of superiority that the military has, unfortunately. Okay. The other thing is that Sadat understood that there was a psychological barrier. And he opted to break that barrier by going to Jerusalem, by addressing the Knesset. Okay? So both from the military aspect, shaking things up, and from the, you might say, human aspect, the public relations aspect, etc., things worked just right. Okay? What did the Palestinians get out of this? Well, basically, the notion that emerged, in fact, was put forward by Begin, was autonomy for the Palestinians, which worked its way into the Camp David agreement and which has worked in its way into subsequent Israeli thinking. But the Palestinians did not get a great deal out of that. Okay. The other notable example was the Oslo Agreement. Now, the mediation here was not perhaps such an arduous effort. It received little publicity, but Norway was involved. It wasn't the United States. The United States adopted it and embraced it after Oslo got off the ground, and President Clinton hosted signing ceremonies at the White House and things of that sort. But again, why did Oslo work? Well, Oslo worked because both parties had an interest, both parties, in seeing it work. Okay. The PLO was ready for a change. The PLO was ready to accept a mini-state. The Palestine National Congress decided that in 1988. The PLO had been kicked out of Lebanon. They were living in exile in Tunisia. Meanwhile, a local leadership for the Intifada had emerged. So the PLO had to do something. Rabin, Israel, had their hands full putting down the first Intifada, which was a peaceful Intifada. And they were getting all sorts of bad press for the way they were handling the situation. So Rabin invited Arafat over, as some skeptics put it, to become his police chief in Gaza. In other words, they put Palestinians in charge of security in the Palestinian area. That was the idea. The PLO had hopes, I think not unreasonable hopes, that this may lead to some kind of Palestinian state at the end. But that didn't work. And it didn't work because there was opposition to it, and the Likud rejected it from the very beginning. Okay. And Netanyahu campaigned against it so indiscriminately that Rabin's wife suggested that he was responsible for the assassination of her husband. Okay. Hamas worked against it through suicide bombings and things like that, which were in retaliation to targeted assassinations of its members and leaders, but nevertheless it worked against it. Okay. So those are examples of successful mediation efforts, which, well, in the case of Oslo, it was successful at the beginning, but it failed later. And you could say part of the reason it failed was that Israeli demands were front-loaded. They were satisfied at the beginning, whereas Palestinian interests and demands were back-loaded to be satisfied at some time in the future, which never came. Okay. All right, so where do we go from here? Okay. As you can see from the fate of the Kerry peace effort, I think it's too late for a two-state solution. I mean, many experts were predicting that before it started. They said if this had been done 10 years ago, it may have stood a chance. Now it's too late. Okay. Because of all the things that have happened, the settlements, the demographic changes in Israel, the rise of nationalism, the rise of religiosity, etc., they're simply not willing to give up the West Bank. Okay. What they have done is separated the West Bank from Gaza. Okay. Gazans were told they could not leave Gaza, go to the West Bank, go anywhere, basically in 1991. And this was before the round of suicide bombings by Hamas. What's the reason? Amir Haas, who's a well-known journalist who writes in Haaretz, says basically this is an attempt to divide the Palestinians, to separate Gaza from the West Bank. What's the interest? Well, if you're going to end up with a one state for both Palestinians and Israelis, it's good to have half the Palestinians out. That gives Israel a demographic advantage. So what we have is by default a de facto annexation of the West Bank. It's not de jure, it's not legal, it's not official, but it is there in fact. Okay. And as far as Hamas is concerned, Israel's policy is mow the lawn every once in a while. Every time Hamas gets strong enough, you go in there, you teach him a lesson, and that lasts a few years. Okay. Where do we go? If there's no two-state solution possible, it has to be a one-state solution. How does a one-state solution work? Well, Palestinians are there Either Israel kicks them out or it lets them stay there. It's not keen to give them citizenship. So there'll be, again, Begin's idea, some kind of autonomy. He suggested there could be like alien residents. They won't have political rights. Okay. So what can the Palestinians do about that? They can try to change their position, struggle for political rights, for civil rights, for human rights. It won't be pretty, it'll be a brutal struggle. But eventually, given that situation, I think they will prevail. Okay. So the outcome that they could work for, that should work for, is a binational state. A binational state is not just one state for Jews and Palestinians. It's a state in which each community, both Israelis and Palestinians, will have political rights as a community, not just as individuals. We want the individuals to have rights, but what we're talking about here is there would be a recognized position for Palestinian culture, for Palestinian traditions, certain rights for the Palestinian community that will be protected by the constitution that cannot be transgressed. And the same thing for Israelis. So Israelis already have that. The thing is for the Palestinians to acquire a niche inside Israel. I don't mean localized. They should be able to go and come work where they please, live where they please, but that they will have rights as a community in a binational state. So I can elaborate on that in case people are interested. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me all right with this? I'm going to just sit here, if that's okay. Thank you, Jenab, and thank you to the Palestine Center for inviting me to be with you today. I'm happy to be with you, although it's not a happy day because of what's going on in Gaza. You know, when the Palestine Center first approached me a few weeks ago and asked me to speak about international mediation, it was a much less interesting and immediate topic than it is right now because of the terrible conflict in Gaza. And I want to start out by saying that, you know, I'm going to be speaking about the diplomacy and the goals and the mediation and so forth. But there's a danger of talking about this as though it's chess pieces on a board, and it's not. Of course, it's human lives, and I just, you know, feel I want to say that I'm very, very cognizant of the huge, tragic toll in human lives in Gaza, and that's something that I think we always need to keep in mind as I will, you know, speak about the diplomacy and the actions of the international players. So I want to make a couple of remarks about how the current conflict in Gaza is similar to the ones that have come before. As we know, right, this is not the first war between Israel and Hamas. There have been several of them. There have been a couple of ground wars and other air wars. And there are ways in which this conflict is similar, but there are some new developments that make this one different. In some ways, you know, it feels as though this is a bad movie that we've seen before, right? The gradual escalation in rockets and in, you know, exchange of attacks, Israeli operations against Hamas leaders, rockets from Gaza, whether from Hamas or Islamic Jihad or other groups, into Israel and so forth, then followed by a ground incursion and this terrible escalation in the cost in human lives, and then eventually a search for a ceasefire in which both parties, Israel and Hamas, tried to, you know, deny the other a clear victory, at least, if not, and with the Palestinian Authority kind of standing by, more or less helpless. It seems like we've seen this play out several times. And there are ways in which what's going on now is unfortunately going to play out, I think, in similar ways, in the sense that I wish I could say that this that what's going on now, this current wave of violence and also the diplomacy that follows it, might result in a fresh look at resolving the overall Palestine issue. But I'm not very hopeful that it will. The previous conflicts have always ended up purely with tactical resolutions, and I'm afraid this one is like that. There are a couple of things, though, that make this conflict different. One of them, and this is just a small observation, is technology. After the last ground war in 2009, and even the last sort of air war in 2012 between Hamas and Israel, the two parties have armed themselves very, very substantially. And this is one of the sad recurring features, that this fight takes place. Israel does what Jenab just referred to as mowing the grass. In other words, the armed capabilities of Hamas are degraded. But then as soon as it's over, the two parties just start arming themselves for the next one, and arming themselves much more heavily. So, of course, the major technological development in this war has been Iron Dome, and how it has made Israel largely impervious to civilian casualties, despite the hundreds and hundreds of missiles that have come over from Gaza. But Hamas, too, has some different technology. And the two developments there, I would say, is one of them is Hamas is now manufacturing its own rockets more than importing them. They used to have to import them whole, and they still are, apparently have imported some of them whole. But we've heard that Hamas had something like 10,000 rockets when this whole thing began. And from what I understand, most of those were manufactured inside of Gaza. And that's a different situation. It's a different situation for anyone talking about demilitarization or something like that, because as we know, I mean, for example, with non-proliferation, with weapons of mass destruction, or when countries have their own capability, when they have the technical know-how to manufacture these things and all they need is the components, it becomes much more difficult to prevent that or control that by any outside power. So that's a different situation here. And then, of course, the tunneling. We knew about all these tunnels between Egypt and Gaza, and now we're finding out about a significant number of tunnels from Gaza into Israel, at least 30 or so of them. And that has now become the focus, I think, of Israel's tactical goals in this conflict, is to close down. And they're now saying that they have destroyed or disabled about half of those tunnels as of now. And I think the Israeli forces, they are unlikely to agree to any ceasefire and withdraw until they're able to say that they accomplished something. And I think the thing they will be saying was that we closed down all or almost all of these tunnels. Because they have to, I think Prime Minister Netanyahu is going to have to justify politically within Israel the costs of this war in terms of the lives of Israeli soldiers. So that, denying Hamas that advantage of these tunnels that go from Gaza into Israel seems to have become the main focus, okay, for Israel. Now, that also, I think, is why, one of the reasons why the ceasefire efforts so far have been unsuccessful. Okay, so technology is one thing that's changed. The other thing that's changed that is really complicating the diplomacy is this change in regional power alignments. Now, as you know, because of a number of factors, because of the Arab uprisings of 2011 and their aftermath, as well as the Saudi-Iranian Cold War, and I would say also to some extent because of the U.S. withdrawal from the region, what we are seeing is this kind of an Arab Cold War, right, or a regional Cold War, because it's not only Arabs. And then there are some specific things that have taken place, whether it's the uprising in Syria or the coup in Egypt last summer, that have really given this a very, very much of a sharp point. So, you've got now Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and it would appear Israel, in one camp, and then in another camp you have Qatar, Turkey, to some extent Iran, although Iran, as we now know, is not playing much of a role right now in the Gaza conflict because Hamas and Iran had a falling out over Syria. And Iran has not, had the relationship of support with Hamas in recent years that it once had. So the fact that you have these two different camps, and that at the same time that there are specific goals for all those parties related to the Gaza conflict and related to the struggle between Israel and Hamas, but they're also very, very determined, the two camps, to deny each other any kind of a perceived diplomatic victory or advantage, which has really, I think, has left any outside party, and particularly Secretary of State John Kerry, in a very, very difficult position because not only do the two warring parties, Israel and Hamas, not talk to each other, but they don't talk to the same outside parties either. And Egypt, which used to play the bridging role, used to play at least the mediating role between various Palestinian parties and Israel on one hand, and even between the different Palestinian parties, right, between Hamas and Fatah and so forth, because anyway, Egypt is no longer able to do that. They used to do it in the past, not only under Morsi. Everyone's talking now about when they had the Brotherhood president, but let's even forget that. Let's talk about under Mubarak. Egypt was perceived by the Palestinian parties as reasonably even-handed. Let's say even-handed enough. We all know, everybody knew, it was always the case that the Egyptian government favored the secular Palestinian leadership over Hamas and tried to a limited ability in all of the agreements and so forth that it brokered to promote the interests of the PLO leadership rather than Hamas. But still, Hamas viewed Egypt as even-handed enough to serve as a broker. Now, Egypt still plays a very critical role. They control that border from Gaza into Israel at Rafah. They have something that Hamas wants very much, which is access to the outside world. Hamas it certainly doesn't want to be and I would say even beyond Hamas, Gazans in general do not want to be dependent on Israel for their only access to the outside world. They'd like to have a backdoor out, which is Egypt. So Egypt still plays an important role. I do not mean to say here that Egypt is irrelevant. It's still very relevant. However, I would say Egypt right now is more of a party to this conflict than it is a real mediator. At the same time, the Egyptian government has been determined to prevent anybody else from being the mediator, like Qatar or Turkey, which has made it, and that's part of the trap that John Kerry found himself in last week. The other part of the trap is what I referred to earlier, that Israel simply wasn't ready for a ceasefire. I was thinking that, when you look at a piece of real estate and people say the value of of any given piece of real estate is determined by three factors: location, location, and location. Well, I would say the same thing about a ceasefire, that the value of a ceasefire proposal is probably determined by timing, timing, and timing. And, the very same ceasefire proposal that is now being treated as completely objectionable, and even outrageous and so forth by the Israelis, might be acceptable in 3 days or a week or 2 weeks or whenever Israel decides that it's got to get out, either because it has achieved tactical aims that it thinks justifies the whole operation, or whatever. These are very unpredictable events, these kind of conflicts. They spin out of control, and some very bad things could happen. And at some point, the Israelis will want to end this operation in Gaza. And then, so, we will see. I think, Egypt is now trying to take up once again its mediating role. The first Egyptian ceasefire proposal, I thought, was a very curious episode, very, very unusual, in which Egypt basically announced a ceasefire a couple of weeks ago that was coordinated with Egypt, was not coordinated with Hamas. Yet it was put out publicly, and Hamas immediately said, well, this hasn't been presented to us. We don't agree to this. We haven't even seen it. And then Prime Minister Netanyahu in Israel immediately said, well, Hamas has rejected the ceasefire, which now provides Israel with international legitimacy to expand its operation in Gaza. Very curious, I think, for an Arab state like Egypt to have played that kind of a role, and not the traditional role that Egypt would have played. So we see these, these power games playing out. And it has made, as I said, it has made international mediation very difficult, and it led to this very ugly episode in which I think Secretary of State Kerry tried once to go to the region when he was on his way home from talks with Iran in Vienna, and he was basically waved off, told, don't come, we don't need you. Then after Israel went in on the ground and the casualties really started escalating in Gaza, he basically insisted, I'm coming, and he did, and he tried to broker something, and because the Egyptians weren't speaking directly to Hamas, he started speaking also to Qatar and Turkey, who were in direct communication with Hamas, and then he was harshly criticized by the Israelis and the Egyptians for doing that. I think, as I said, partly because of this regional power game, and partly because the parties simply didn't welcome a ceasefire because they weren't ready for it yet. So I guess I will stop there. I mean, it's unfortunate. The conflict in Gaza is it's bad enough without having these other power games being played out at the same time. Right, that on the part of Egypt, it's President Sisi's struggle against the Muslim Brotherhood and its affiliate Hamas. He's trying to further his aims in that struggle through whatever he does regarding Gaza. And by the way, I mean, I think another Egyptian interest here is they don't want to end up holding the hot potato. So we know, unfortunately, Gaza is a hot potato, and nobody wants to be the one responsible for it. The Israelis have tried a number of times to sort of push it in the direction of Egypt. When you were saying a one-state solution, Jenab, I'm not sure what you thought about Gaza, what would become the fate of Gaza. But I think, in the eyes of some, it would be good for Egypt to basically take over Gaza again. But I think the Egyptians are determined not to do that. They have their own national security interests. They have an insurgency going on in the Sinai. The last thing they want is to take on responsibility for Gaza, to have a lot of people and weapons and things flowing back and forth from Gaza into the Sinai. And also, they don't want to become responsible for preventing attacks on Israel from Gaza. As we've all seen, that's extremely difficult to do, and they're not going to be responsible for it. Let me say one last thing. We hear, in the kind of international discourse about what's going on in Gaza and what the outcome might be, there are these terms that people throw around like demilitarization, ousting Hamas from Gaza, reasserting Palestinian Authority control over Gaza. And we saw even, for example, the Washington Post editorial today criticized Secretary Kerry for not promoting these kind of aims in his diplomacy. I have to say, I think Secretary Kerry was quite correct to view this whole conflict as very tactical, and that unfortunately its resolution will also be tactical. Those kind of broader goals like demilitarization or change of authority in Gaza from Hamas to Palestinian Authority, as desirable as they might be. First of all, I think they're almost impossible to achieve for military and other reasons. Second, I don't even think that's what Israel wants. I don't think that those accord with Israel's aims here, and I don't think they would be welcome on the part of the Israelis. Even though you might hear people saying these things, but they're really talking points. They are not. If you listen to Israeli military officials or so forth talking about what's going on here, those are not the kind of outcomes they truly have in mind. So I think that would be something that any international mediator would have to keep in mind.
this point, we'd like to open the floor for questions. We just ask that you keep your questions relatively short, as we'd like to get through everyone, give everyone the chance to ask, as well as give our speakers enough time to answer as they would see fit. So you can just start, sort of Paul, start here.
Hi. I have three quick points. One is in terms of technology and how things are different now. I think you might want to consider the use of drones against Gaza, which is new and deadly. And the second thing is that, maybe the third thing too, neither one of you talked about the effect of the huge amounts, the billions of dollars that the U.S. is giving to Israel. And in fact, Harry Reid, just yesterday, I guess, was begging, well, not begging, but demanding millions of dollars to go to Israel, saying Israel needs more money, and castigating the Republicans for not acting fast enough, which I thought was ironic. So that's one thing, is the tremendous amount of money that the U.S. has chosen to use in this conflict. And then more deleterious is the amount of money that the U.S. uses to bribe Egypt to maintain its stance concerning the closing of the border, and threatening to take away its billions of dollars in support for Egypt if Egypt changes its stance.
Shall we go ahead? Yeah.
Well, obviously, obviously,
Do you have it turned on? There's an on-off switch there.
hello? Hello?
It's on.
Okay, I have to hold it up here. Suggestions for, I mean, the history of U.S. subsidies to Israel is a topic that's been well covered, and you'll find some excellent works on that. Obviously, the motive of members of Congress speaking up now saying we should send more money to Israel has to do with their own personal careers and attempts to enhance border support for them than anything that's really related to what's going on the ground. The cost to Israel of this war has been really minimal. And
We're paying for it. We're paying for it.
well, we are supporting Israel financially, yes. Where the money for this particular war came from, I can't really say.
It came from us.
As far as Egypt is concerned, Egypt has been rather contemptuous at the suggestion that Israel can be bought with $2 billion. And they've more or less said you can take your money and do something rude with it. They can use the money, but they're getting $7 billion from Gulf states and more. So they've been compensated for the money they're not getting from the United States. And for a country of 90 million people, $2 billion is a drop in the bucket. It basically goes to the military, and the military benefit from it. And apparently the military are saying we can manage without.
Let me just add a couple of points. You're quite right about drones being a new factor. And there have also been, a couple of drones that have flown over Israel from Gaza. So, drones they're a factor, and they're something that they're obviously technology that's widely available and not very expensive, and will be used by more than one party here. So that's one issue on I want to add something about Egypt. So the U.S. military and economic assistance to Egypt originally was in the context of the Camp David agreement, and it was in the context that Jenab mentioned of this sort of realignment of Egypt away from the Soviet bloc and into the American orbit and so forth. And I think it's more about that than it is about the peace with Israel. I really think that after the 67 war and the 73 war and so forth, the Egyptian military does not want to fight another war with Israel. They can't win a war with Israel, certainly, and it has very heavy costs for them politically inside the country. So I am pretty convinced that even if the United States withdrew all of its assistance from Egypt, that you would not see Egypt behaving any differently toward Israel and toward the border at Rafah, because they control the border. This has to do with the national security interests of Egypt. As I said, they are they have a very unstable area in the Sinai, and frankly, especially after last summer, they have an insurgency going on throughout the country. I don't know if you saw. I mean, there were 22 Egyptians killed in an attack by militants in the Western Desert just a week ago. I mean, these things are going on all around the country in Egypt. So they want to keep that border with Gaza sealed as much as possible for their own national security interests. And I really don't think it is not because the United States is paying them to do it. I mean, what we saw in the past was at times when they were not as worried about security inside of Sinai and inside of Egypt, how many tunnels? There were a couple of thousand, apparently, tunnels from between Egypt and Gaza, and people and goods and arms. Everything was flowing in and out, and there was a lot of corruption going on. This went on for years, despite the fact that the United States and Israel and everyone, pleaded with them and criticized them, the Egyptians, that is. Okay? So when they were not worried about it, they let things flow in and out of Gaza. Now that they became worried about it for their own reasons, now they sealed it off. Okay, and the security relations and cooperation between Egypt and Israel have been closer than probably ever before in the last year, and this is at a time when U.S. military assistance to Egypt is still partially frozen. It's still actually significantly frozen. There have been no major weapons deliveries from the United States to Egypt in the past year. Not something you hear about every day, but they're just not going. The F-16s, the tanks, even the Apache helicopters still have not gone, right, because of U.S. concerns about the coup in Egypt and the aftermath and so forth, right? So even though U.S.-Egyptian military relations are not so great right now, Egyptian-Israeli military relations are closer than ever. Why? Because it serves Egypt's national security interests. They want Israel's help against militants in the Sinai and so forth, and they're cooperating very closely on that. So I think that the Egyptian-Israeli relationship has its own dynamic now, and it is not something that the United States just pays for and makes happen because of this military assistance.
There's one thing, sorry, I should have added. We are paying for the Iron Dome.
Yeah, of course.
And the man behind that is, guess who? President Obama, who made sure that Israel got it. So criticisms of Obama are sort of examples of ingratitude when they come from Israel.
Continue on this side.
Yes, thank you. Can you speak to the role of mediators in this context where the U.S. Arms and subsidizes the arming of one party, one side in the conflict, i.e. Israel, politically supports Israel. All the U.S. politicians are 100% behind Israel, vetoes Security Council resolutions in favor of Israel, allows U.S. citizens to go and join the army of Israel and fight in the Israeli army, and how that reflects on the role of, or how that in a in a mediation situation, how that could affect the role of the mediator, and the potential for someone else coming and playing a more honest mediating role in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Thank you.
I'll take a crack at it. The U.S. gets involved. You might notice Arabs beg Israel, the U.S. to get involved. And then they say, why can't you be an honest mediator? Well, the U.S. has its own interests. And the thing is, the Arabs are desperate for somebody who has influence over Israel to step in, and the most likely candidate is the United States. So when the United States has become involved, it has tried to do some good. On occasion, it has been successful. But it caters to Israel's demands more than it caters to Palestinian demands, because Israel is the stronger party and because Israel has clout in the United States, which the Palestinians don't, you know. So the only thing the basic thing I have to say on behalf of the United States is Arabs ask it to get involved. They say, please come. We need you.
Let me just add, I think hypothetically, it would be great to have mediators that are completely disinterested, that don't have, a special relationship with any of the parties, and that can really be fair, right? So we've seen, for example, Ban Ki-moon in the current conflict, try to play a role and so forth. But one of the things I think the parties are looking for in any mediation is guarantees. Who's going to guarantee that whatever is agreed upon in the mediation actually takes place? And that's where you have parties who have an interest or a stake having to play a role in the mediation. So, that's pretty obvious with Israel, right? Israel is always looking for security guarantees of various kinds, and it normally will not accept them from any party other than the United States, right? That who's going, if we make this agreement, and let's say, for example, if we were ever talking about the creation of a Palestinian state, and what would the security arrangements be in the Jordan Valley? It's, Israel wants guarantees, wants to agree on that with the United States, not with the Palestinian state, not with Jordan, not with NATO. No, the United States. That's the only party they'll accept security guarantees from. Same thing with other parties. That's one of the reasons why Egyptian mediation with Hamas has not worked this time. In 2012, Hamas accepted some guarantees, or some promises at least, from Egypt that there would be a greater opening of the borders of Gaza and more people and goods would be able to get in and out. That was in November 2012, at the end of the last conflict between Israel and Hamas. And they had in the past accepted guarantees from Egypt about greater openness at Rafah. Well, it didn't happen, and in particular in the last year, since the military took over in Egypt, they really closed those borders and even the tunnel with Rafah. That's why Hamas is now saying, well, we can't accept any guarantees from Egypt now. Somebody else, like Qatar, or we have to have someone who's in our corner, so to speak, who's going to be a party to this mediation, who's going to guarantee that whatever is promised to us actually happens. So, it isn't entirely fair, and sometimes that means that there isn't a single party that can carry out the mediation, because no one party, the warring parties will not accept guarantees necessarily from the same outside mediator.
We can get someone on this side, maybe the gentleman in the front.
Okay. I'm sort of going to echo what the two questioners before me spoke about, because it really is at the heart of the issue. Who is the United States financing? Who was responsible in 48? Who was responsible for the UN? everything is just weighted against the Palestinian people. It's basically a bully situation where people are being bullied, and it just never stops. Now, the other part of the question or statement is, too many people now have invested careers in this situation. And I don't want to point to you two only, but no, but seriously, it goes on and on. Ambassadors, the politicians, the American politicians. In other words, we need to clear the scene, and there is no real international established organization that is able to do this. So it goes on and on with this lower level of people continually suffering, and other people having careers that go on and on, analyzing, participating in. So that has to really be brought out. I mean, this thing has to be cleaned up before it can be settled. And it's about real estate. It's a real estate issue. It's not about Jews and Palestinians so much as about real estate. I just wanted to make that statement and get
I
it.
want to apologize to Jenab about being a party to all of this.
Well, I'm an American citizen too, so.
I mean, I'm not trying to be critical so much as just put on the table what is really going on here. The question is, how are we going to get beyond this to where people's lives can be really secured on both sides?
Okay, the point is the U.S. does have its own interests and its own constraints. There are constraints on U.S. There are constraints on U.S. decision makers, people in the administration. There's pressures on them. They have, I mean, sometimes done good. Sometimes it has failed. Who rescued the Egyptian Third Army when it was besieged by Israel? It was the United States. Who helped put an end to the 1958 civil war in Lebanon? It was the United States, working with Egypt. You just witnessed an effort by Secretary Kerry to put together a two-state solution. It did not work. I think people say, well, the United States should put pressure on Israel in order to be more accommodating, to make more concessions. I think that is what we would like to see. I think that's what would be fair. But simply politically speaking, why do you have the expectation that this will happen?
Yeah, I think, for me, the more interesting question is what Jenab talked about in his opening comments. In other words, where might this thing going? And I suspect he's right about what he said, that the whole phase of diplomatic pursuit of a two-state solution has been coming to a long, slow end for quite a while now, since the late 90s at least, right? And that the whole conflict probably is moving into a different phase, perhaps of a one-state, binational state type of conflict, and that will be because of the demographic realities. I mean, and so forth. Because of the settlements, but also because of the demographic realities of the numbers of Palestinians as opposed to Israelis in the, if the Israelis are insisting on keeping all this territory together and not letting it be divided into two states, well then that is gradually taking things in that direction. And we will see. I think one of the big questions to me now is what's happening on the West Bank. We've started to see the West Bank start to heat up in reaction to what's going on in Gaza. I don't know if that will continue or not. If it does, that can change things a lot, I think. But it probably is going to keep things moving in the direction of a different kind of a Palestinian struggle.
We have time for just one more short question, so if we could keep it as short as possible. Perhaps this gentleman in the suit over here? Just one second.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. But in fairness, I wonder if I could defer to the gentleman in front of me who's had his hand up the whole time.
That's completely your choice.
Appreciate that. Thanks, Ben. There have been a series of articles, pieces coming out of INSS by the senior people there, academics and former generals, that seem to have one theme, which is that it's time to stop thinking completely tactically and to try for something which exchanges demilitarization, as hard as that may be, with reconstruction and development and allowing the Gazans to export and have a life and so forth and so on. Does that reflect any thinking beyond the group of people at INSS? How feasible is it? I mean, there are technologies that could be brought to bear at the borders that haven't been, and so forth, in terms of control and security. And who would have to be involved? Presumably, you know, the Israelis are not going to fund that.
I can give my view on this. Look, I mean, it's understandable and it's right that people on various sides of this are trying to look beyond, you know, this simple, you know, these tactical wars that go on and on, you know, at such terrible cost and never changing the overall situation. But in terms of, so what demilitarization of Gaza would have to involve, to me, is one of two things. Scenario one, Hamas is utterly defeated militarily, and even perhaps the military leadership of Hamas is actually deported from Gaza. I mean, as the PLO was once from Lebanon, you know, that type of scenario. I don't see that happening. You know, the other scenario is one in which Hamas somehow cooperates with demilitarization, and some people have made this argument in Israel in exchange for some enormous, you know, billions and billions in economic benefits for Gaza. I don't see that happening. So I just don't see how this happens. And as I said, even if Israel wanted to promote somehow a defeat of Gaza, a defeat of Hamas and a replacement of the PA into Gaza, I mean that's a much bigger war than what's going on right now. I don't see Israel willing to do that, and I think it's very difficult to do, even if they were willing to do it. So, you know, I just and what I hear when I listen to Israeli political leaders or military leaders speak about Gaza, it's not this. It's a much more limited, you know, it is degrading Hamas's military capabilities and maybe depriving them, at least for now, of the ability to use the tunnels, and that's it.
I'd like to introduce a historical note. The ban on the mobility of the people of Gaza began, guess when? 91, exactly. Why? And how? I mean, there was a military order that had allowed them to move about, to enter Israel, to go to the West Bank. It was rescinded on the eve of the Gulf War. And it has been rescinded since. So some Gazans tried to come to the West Bank through the Allenby Bridge by going to Egypt, flying to Jordan. And again, an explicit order was issued banning Gazans from coming in across the Allenby Bridge unless they actually had a permit from Israel to do so. So the thing I conclude from this is Israel wants Gaza to be quiet, but it wants Gaza to be separate from the West Bank. So the idea of extending, as you were saying, the authority of the Palestinian Authority to the West Bank is not something Israel is trying to achieve. They want Gaza gone, out, away. We don't want to see you. We don't want to hear from you. Be quiet.
Well, we thank you very much, both of you, for